Hello everyone, today we talk about the Piedmontese nobleman Conrad of Montferrat, mostly for our not just medieval but Crusader warfare series. Looking a bit more at the figure in itself, this is actually a special. There's not a series about single historical figures, characters, say biographies. I would like to start that. I tried with Vlad Tzepes, and it was a success. This is not a biography. This is mostly about Conrad's involvement in the crusade in which he embarked, driven surely more by personal ambition than, say, even possible desire to liberate the Holy Land, as he would land there in 1187, so the situation had gone rapidly downhill. Naturally, Conrad was a Christian. Like, we don't have any evidence at this point against any of these protagonists of having a truly faithful commitment. Right? But the situation was so desperate that very shrewdly Conrad actually decided with great courage to step into the situation and even solving it. Essentially, if the Crusader states went on for, like in the Holy Land, for another century, it is his merit. Because if Tyre had fallen to the Saladin, as it was about to happen, like also the Third Crusade would have been very different. Not even Acre could have been retaken. And so, you know, that I have a Crusader warfare playlist talking, in fact, about the same Athens and the siege of Acre 1291 in detail. So, ad majora, let's expand on this. Notably, Conrad managed to defeat the renowned Saladin in the aforementioned siege of Tyre, but subsequently would turn against the same king, Richard, the Lionheart of England. I made a video about him for the English monarchy series. We talked, for that matter, also about Frederick Barbarossa on multiple occasions. So all the protagonists of the era must be actually analyzed more in focus, especially as far as their military expeditions are concerned. And in the disagreement between Conrad and Richard, the former emerged victorious, only to have, however, say, history in a general sense ultimately vindicating the British monarch, and because mostly of cultural literary reasons. I mean, the fact that Walter Scott unfortunately indulged into the Black Legion against the, say, in this case, the Italian in the Lombard, in the wake of the anti-papist, anti-Catholic vibe that, anyhow, like the Mediterranean, like the Southern Europe, was embodying, according to him, also in that sort of racialistic sense. The reason for which, and we will talk about this in the end, you know that Conrad, especially I think if you are from Britain, embodies literally all those sense of, you know, archetypal darkness and slipperiness and sort of untrustworthiness and more. And naturally, the 12th century is a very complex one in history. We already discussed attentively the general context from which most of the protagonists of this video came from, and you know how incredibly messed up in so many ways it is politically and militarily. So we'll look better at what happened, and it's difficult not to see Conrad instead of some sort of heroic figure in that same archetypal vision. There is all a bit of mystery in the enigma surrounding the murder of the same Conrad of Montferrat, which will likely remain forever unsolved for the reasons we will explain later. The perpetrator remains shrouded in the mist of history. The numerous individuals who had an excellent motive for wanting his death, many being unscrupulous, skilled and resolute individuals like him, right, capable of concocting a plan so effective that it achieved its goal without revealing the instigator and to the mystery's complexity, but it's really down to the obvious political and historical context that we lose the hope in really learning who had commissioned that hit. And there were many reasons, but mostly revolving around Conrad's effectiveness as a ruler that was increasingly a problem, especially for the main neighbors in the region. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had been half saved, basically, by Conrad's action, like his successors would be instead weak. So whoever took him out at least accomplished a broader objective than just assassinating a random political figure. Now, the Aleramic clan, to which Conrad belonged, was one of the most prominent noble families in northern Italy. We've never talked about the Aleramics. We talked about Piedmont, so coming across them every once in a while. This was one of the most ancient families in the region, also with a lot of international blood ties, and really of the first order. In fact, the same Conrad was first cousin both to Frederick I and Louis VII of France. Right, so in this period in which especially the Germanic Empire was at the peak of its historical power, the second half of the 12th century, Capetian France was being molded. Right, in a few decades, it would essentially boom, right, to reach the same Mediterranean, opening to the direct, say, naval participation to the Crusades, and the major participants in that regard speak it up. Right, this would be important also to pave the way to Conrad's role in the Holy Land, especially against the English participants instead. But the Aleramics had close relationships in these very years with not just Hohenstaufen, Germany, or Capetian France, but the same England. Right, we have talks by William V, Conrad's father, to marry his son to a daughter of Henry II of England, so actually sister of the same Richard Lionheart. One of William's children was, and we do not know who, was engaged to William of Scotland's sister, by the way. There was also a general friendship between the Aleramics and Emmanuel Comnenus, especially as we will see now after the Barbarossa's defeat at Legnano. We made multiple videos on the general context, because the Marquises of Montferrat had been actually some of the most notoriously Ghibelline, imperially faithful vassals in Italy. You know that at this point the communes were already a big thing. In fact, to defeat the same emperor in open field in 1176, whereas these other feudal polities like Montferrat were aiming, just looking as we've seen at the international range of hierarchical connections, to be at least co-opted as some sort of feudal rulers, right, in some parts of Italy, as it technically really was. There's all a history of Conrad during these years that is very complicated. We can't simply digress on it, because I want to talk just about the figure in the Crusades as King of Jerusalem. But there was a lot going on, and the same friendship with the Comnenoi was part of that sort of, ambiguous relations with the same Hohenstaufen, because as soon as the Germans were defeated at Legnano, and I really advise Paul Magdalena's biography of Emmanuel Comnenus in this, like the entire European, Mediterranean, Levantine political, strategical, diplomatic assets changed, right? And the same Montferrat had basically to bail out temporarily of that Ghibelline alliance, at some point siding with the same popes and actually going at war with the same imperial representatives. For example, Conrad, that was there's an important note here. His father, William V, was captured at the Battle of Atten. Right, he was already in Outremer, and his son wouldn't succeed as Marquis. Right, he had brothers, by the way, that had also different international connections, because you had these feudal houses and they do not all go compactly in the same direction. This is really like a moment of great, as you know, knightly chivalric deeds. There is this level of adventurism, of bold chances, signings, etc. Initially, we know of Conrad helping in Tuscany the imperial chancellor Christian of Mainz, punishing Pisa in favor of Genoa, the latter having also an important role, as you know, in the Holy Land, and the Genoese, albeit also for other reasons, would end up supporting Conrad as king of Jerusalem. Eventually, he fought against the same imperials. He was captured by the same Christian of Mainz. Eventually, he was ransomed, and he fought against the imperials in the marches on the Adriatic in Camerino, where he captured the same Christian of Mainz, who was also released later. We do not know whether he participated to the siege of Ancona, etc., but he had different tasks. For example, he escorted papal legates to Modena for the peace talk of Venice that he also attended. He had other missions, like involvements. By the way, he also married the sister of Isaac II Angelos in that tormented last phase of Byzantine history before the Fourth Crusade, reason for which Conrad was actually Caesar of the Byzantine Empire. Like, Caesar at this point was just a title bestowed, especially in this sort of Frankish mimicking fashion by the Byzantines to these foreigners that married their princes. In this case, Theodora, however, died, I think, just 1 year later. So this is important because Conrad would go on marrying the heiress to the throne of Jerusalem later. But just for saying what kind of background we're discussing, Conrad was the second son of William V, Marquis of Montferrat. He was born in the 40s of the 12th century, likely 1146. We're not sure. The exact date of his birth remains unknown. As we were pointing out, prior to his involvements in the Crusades, Conrad had a distinguished military career in Italy during the 70s and the 80s of the same century, demonstrating exceptional strength, remarkable courage, and notable political acumen. After the strained relations with the imperials, and especially with the election of Pope Alexander II that had essentially brought down what had been elected by the opposite faction supported by Conrad, what was called at the time Innocent III, that, as you know, wouldn't come to be that pope. That this was a guy from Setza, the other from Segni, just for also remembering the centrality of Lazio in this time, like the important nobiliar families of the Roman countryside, and made a video about medieval Lazio if you're interested about that too. And at that point, Conrad decided to join the crusade. It started actually with his Byzantine marriage. He went over to Constantinople, where the situation wouldn't favor him particularly at court, mostly because of the opposition of the Branas clan. And so, feeling compelled by a sense of duty, he decided to join the crusade. He barely escaped an Islamic capture while at sea. He arrived in the Holy Land in late July 1187. So, as we were saying at the beginning, sort of the worst times ever, but that again offered lots of opportunities to bold risk takers. In fact, the Outremer was in great turmoil. The Crusader army had recently been decimated in the Battle of Atten. Very interesting battle from a tactical point of view. It was not even that, utter tactical disaster. We often assume, if we look at battles like Manzikert or Hattin and the immediate sort of political and strategical consequences, that the battle in itself was just a pure tactical disaster. It wasn't. There were chunks of the Crusader army that made it to Tiberias. It was also a closely fought one, and the enemies had their losses as well. But as you know, the cities and fortresses of the Kingdom of Jerusalem were surrendering to Saladin's forces one by one. Jerusalem, the same, would fall. The movie of Kingdom of Heaven is, as you know, set in this context, except they don't show you what happened later. They make all this stupid story in the end, because I honestly dislike that movie, aside from some aesthetic aspects that are even too sort of vague for medieval, material concreteness. I think it's a pretty boring movie. So, upon arriving in the significant city, the port city of Tyre, Conrad found it overflowing with refugees and poised to capitulate at the first sighting of Saladin's banners on the horizon. In fact, the local authorities had been negotiating with the same Saladin to surrender Tyre, which would have been a major disaster. Saladin was so confident that the city was taken that he had sent his own insignia to be hanged on the citadel of Tyre. And Conrad was not a man to surrender without a fight. He had all this nobiliar blood, international connections to boast. By the way, as soon as the Crusaders had been crushed at Hattin, essentially the Third Crusade was started being prepared. So Conrad, being cousin to both the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of France, was like a key figure in many ways. It had already been, like the alignment of Montferrat had been, as we've seen, quite a thing between the Byzantines, the Crusaders from quite a while. And he successfully convinced the defenders of Tyre that it was premature to surrender the city, and requested to be elected as both political and military leader of the city. He created a sort of commune, like they used to do in Italy, except this time with sort of more feudal representatives. He essentially threw Saladin's banners in the ditch. By the way, Saladin approached Tyre by with his army, threatening the city, of course, and promising Conrad that his father William would have been released had he, from prison, he surrendered the city. This is particularly important, that the Saint Guy of Lusignan had been captured at Hattin. This would be important in the story of Conrad. And despite Tyre being part of the kingdom of Jerusalem, whose king, in fact, Guy, was being held captive by Saladin, the citizens of Tyre, bereft of leaders and with few surviving crusaders, accepted Conrad's offer. And this would bring to all political, legal, and diplomatical ambiguity, because from that moment onwards, Tyre was known as the Marquise's city. Conrad wouldn't release it. There were different, apparently, because some is reported, but explanation for this. The fact that he had saved the city, so it was his by right of conquest. The fact that Guy in prison could not even sustain his own retinue, his own court, his own household. The fact that he had been a king before, now he wasn't anymore given his condition, and Tyre would become his stronghold as long as he would die in the Holy Land anyway, but in all these events throughout the siege of Acre, like the arrival of Richard Lionheart, Louis VII, and so on. Conrad's ability to convey enthusiasm and determination undoubtedly contributed to his success in convincing the defenders of Tyre. While waiting for the Islamic hordes, the Montferrat devoted himself energetically not only to strengthening the city walls, but above all to reinvigorating the morale of its inhabitants. It's all about moral forces, and then matter helps, but it's secondary. So when Saladin, after a long series of conquests, because again, the king of Jerusalem, what was left was crumbling, right, under his onslaught, arrived in front of Tyre, where in November 1187, the Ayyubid ruler found the city prepared to resist him. The siege ultimately ended with a victory for the Christians, both on land and at sea. The Saracens tried to block the port, but the Christian forces managed to set the enemy ships on fire. That was the major deal. It wouldn't save Acre in 1291, as we've seen in detail, but if the city was well defended and supplied, watch those videos about the Italian maritime republics mostly, and what role they had logistically in all of this. It would be a hopeless enterprise. I mean, not always, it wasn't to be given for granted, but Saladin tried, right, to storm the city, and he realized that had he continued, he would have essentially lost a great part of what he had accomplished fantastically with the victory at Apton, etc. And Saladin, as you know, was one of the greater commanders of the era. This is important because Saladin's first setback since Apton was in fact Conrad's resistance in Tyre. In January 1188, the Saracens, exhausted and overwhelmed, were forced to leave the siege. An extraordinary result that made Conrad one of the great protagonists in those remarkable events, and it is thanks to him that if the Christian presence was maintained in Palestine, which allowed the survival of the Kingdom of Jerusalem for another century. When in the year 1189 the armies of the Third Crusade began to flow into the Holy Land, Tyre represented a precious bridgehead for them. Firmly held by the Al-Aramic family, which further increased their prestige. In the process, in the subsequent years, the Holy Land was backdrop for two bitter battles. Here there is all a complex situation going on with, again, Guy of Lusignan claims to the throne, mostly, and the fact that, of course, especially for the French and the Germans, the Montferrats represented truly like a trustworthy connection. Consider the French and English were overall antagonistic in all this. Like the French and Germans didn't like much either, but say it was this French-German bloc that was also weakened, as you know, by the death of Frederick Barbarossa in Anatolia, which surely changed a lot of things, because knowing him, we think he would have surely accomplished a lot. It would have been truly epic to see the entire thing unfold with him and Lionheart and so on. The point is that when all these forces arrived, Conrad was obliged, of course, to participate to the expedition, which was also, like, of course, something he wanted to do, and that could bring its fruits of chivalric glory and heavenly earning, let's say. But he had now to join with the same families that had been opposing him, had been supporting the same Guy of Lusignan. The Crusader armies from the European continent were led, thus after the death of Frederick Barbarossa, by Philip Augustus of France and Richard the Lionheart of England. They had vowed to avenge the outcome of Athens, of course, and re-establish the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Through Cross had been lost. It was a major disaster, like the treasury of the kingdom had been, of course, seized by Saladin by vast amounts of riches. The same Jerusalem had fallen. I mean, it was really that disastrous of a situation. It was the famous 2-year siege of St. John of Acre that was eventually recaptured. In the various battles that were fought around the stronghold, with the Saracens, as you know, trying to break the block, there is an interesting episode, which we will see now. Essentially, Saladin had cleverly released Guy de Lusignan with the intention of sowing discord among the Franks, mostly directed at Conrad, that, as we've seen, had sort of shamed the Islamic forces at Tyre. And in spite of all the things that Conrad and Guy had said to one another, was an episode in combat when the Muslims were essentially overwhelming the Christians that retreated in one of these minor engagements, and with great sense of chivalry, Guy offered a horse to Conrad that was on foot, and he would have been captured had he stayed there, so proving like that bondage, after all, that existed between the Christian forces, even with such radically violent disagreements between one another. The final outcome of all these actions, including the recapture of Acre, was, however, modest for the Christians, who managed to wrest only this essentially narrow strip of coastline from the Muslims. In spite of this, the result was satisfactory enough to establish what was known as the Kingdom of St. John of Acre. Right? This outcome was honorable, more symbolic than substantial, like the Third Crusade essentially wouldn't accomplish much more than that. At the same time, the fierce dispute between the Crusaders regarding the possessions of this kingdom was intertwining with the ones that we have already showed, because literally the idea was rather that there wasn't really a kingdom of Jerusalem, that there wasn't a king of Jerusalem anymore. Like the kingdom was in pieces, but there was essentially nobody who could, who had been, first of all, legally crowned, which is very interesting. Conrad essentially managed to oust the Lusignans from certain positions, but he wouldn't attempt crowning, because he thought that when the Crusaders would have arrived, they would have, especially as long as Frederick Barbarossa was still alive, they would have appointed him, so that would have been more official, and we will see now what the dynastic and inheritance issues really were in particular. Conrad had successfully defended Tyre, as we've seen. He felt really qualified to advance his claim to the throne. On the other side, you had King Guy, who had been freed from captivity by Saladin in the summer of 1188, seeking to claim the crown for himself. Guy and Conrad did not, of course, disappoint Saladin's expectation. They had begun to engage in this first struggle for the crown of this apparent kingdom. And the rivalry between Conrad and Guy soon involved prominent figures. The Saint Philip Augustus, King of France, who allied himself with his cousin Conrad and backed his crowning. while the King of England, Richard the Lionheart, supported Guy. Also because the Lusignans were vassals of the Angevin kings in France, and so there was already some connection there. Obviously, there was, as we were saying, mostly an Anglo-French rivalry in all this, for which obvious reasons. The dynastic history of Louis' marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the divorce, the fact that they had conceived just female descendants, and instead, when Eleanor married Henry II, they had like an insanity of children. I think like 12 or 13. We were talking about this in the video about medieval literature, like recently you find it in the 12th century playlist. And these were really the greatest powers in Europe, and this was enormous regional and essentially crypto-universal ambitions, right? At least until the German crown was sort of performing like France and England had, but especially if you consider what the so-called Angevin Empire really was, like the possibility of any of this power becoming the leading one in Europe would be quite concrete. In fact, it would be the French eventually after Bouvines that finally took off, that they mentioned, made multiple videos, as you know, including about the battle tactically, but the greater significance of the Sunday of Bouvines, and evidently Caesar-papistic concept of power, especially the French had in an imperial sense. France had always been an empire rather than a kingdom. We must be honest really about this. And the same Angevins here were French, and they were essentially of the same mold. There was a bit of more of a Norman blood in there that was much more aggressive and and bold, and that kind of brave, and that's why we talk of the Lionheart in general. But of course here all involved, as you've seen, were great knights, great leaders, great commanders. Notably, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and this was really the matter legally, already had an effective ruler in the person of Queen Sibylla. She was Guy's wife, and it was Sibylla who had granted Guy the crown of Jerusalem by marrying him, and had legitimately ruled during his absence in captivity, as he was prisoner of Saladin. And this was particularly important because, yes, in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, this female inheritance was possible, but it also meant that the husband's rights were, in the sense, more tenuous. Of course, women could not rule traditionally. They could hold this right of inheritance, but they needed, of course, a male protector, and it could be anyone. It could be a brother, it could be a husband, and this was the case as well. And dramatically enough, Sibylla herself provided, unfortunately, a solution to simplify the dynastic problem in 1109. In fact, she died, along with her two daughters, as a result of an epidemic that had afflicted the Crusader camp. This was the brutal reality of the times. Think about the Saint Louis IX dying of epidemic in the following century. Just think about the hygienic conditions, like the logistical problems of supplying, etc. In the Palestinian sun during the season, while constantly harassed and surrounded by Saracen horse archers threatening your supply lines under the Oldberg. It was getting pretty uncomfortable in those climatical situations, and yet even succeeding in feats like Arsuf, for example. We will have to talk about all these battles in detail because they were really like a heavy thing. During Hattin, the Saracens had lit up some fires to literally smoke up the Crusaders and making them more thirsty and exhausted than they already were, even actually causing problems to their own Muslim soldiers in the process. It's terrifying sceneries. Now, following Sibylla's death, Guy was left a widower, and thus, in this context, as we explained, actually deprived of any legal claim to the throne, as the legitimate heir was, along the line of succession, Sibylla's half-sister, Isabella. Under pressure from the Frankish nobility, Isabella divorced her husband, that was Humphrey IV of Toron. These were all, noblemen of the King of Jerusalem. The reason why she divorced was that they actually kidnapped her. Conrad specifically organized this, and she apparently wanted, it was all matters of honor, we do not know about the feelings. She initially didn't want to hear about this new marriage. She would marry the same Conrad on November the 24th, 1190. But in fact, she was convinced. Humphrey seems to have been at least considered a weak candidate for this royal union, right, and responsibility. As a result, Conrad became the legitimate aspirant to the throne of Jerusalem. Shortly afterwards, following the death of his father, he would also inherit the title of Marquis of Montferrat, even though, as we've seen, he was already called like that because, again, once the guy is captured, like his son is mostly out there trying to recover everything. He de facto manages the entire situation. Guy of Lusignan was left with nothing but the mere title of widower of a deceased queen. This was a failure, of course, also for the English. Richard Lionheart had initially supported Guy's nomination, of course. However, the English king wouldn't abandon his efforts, and actually continued to support Guy, despite opposition from Conrad and Philip Augustus. When the King of France was compelled to return to Europe due to his domestic issues, Richard was left alone in the Holy Land. He was actually the most important figure there, de facto, facing not only the formidable Saladin, but also the challenge of managing the dynastic dispute that had arisen in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. At this point, Conrad decided to dissociate his fortunes from those of the Crusader army led by King Richard, who had now become hostile towards him. So this is interesting because rumors spread that he had even reached a secret agreement with Saladin. This is also what fostered a bit like the Black Legion that Scott recovered in the Talisman, etc. So this negotiation seemingly was going on until Conrad's death. Seemingly, because at this point there was all a dispute also about the aforementioned territories that had been reconquered or would be reconquered, because this also overlapped to some extent with the siege of Acre. And Conrad would essentially control, especially from the northern part, like most of the power, whereas the south, in the east with Jerusalem, was in the hands of Saladin. And the idea was that Saladin would have had to recognize not just Conrad's title of King of Jerusalem, but essentially half of it, because as we'll see now, Conrad seemed to be very well based now. He had full support from basically everybody except Richard, who was instead struggling, and the counter condition, of course, from Conrad to Saladin was to essentially recognized part of what pertained to the Lionheart in terms of those spoils of war and territories to the Ayyubids. So the turmoil was far from over. In the idea was, of course, is that Conrad would have kept fighting against Saladin to some extent. The most important thing now was to get rid of Richard, because it was a problem for the both of them. Conrad to his kingship, and quite literally, and Saladin for simply like this mighty foe that had defeated the Saracens multiple occasions, showing again an incredible control, bravery. The Muslims said that Richard exposed himself too much, that he would actually die because of this back in France. But objectively, it was like the knightly chivalric warfare of the time, the fact that still these reigns were not so, say, autarchically compact, like all barons wanted to charge before their ruler, that they saw as a primus inter pares, if anything. So the cold blood, but also the incredible courage displayed, especially at Arsuf, in keeping everybody at bay and deciding the right moment to charge, because a moment too soon or too late could be fatal for the army, and just involving yourself personally in that physical risk out there with all what you had as a king of one of the greatest powers in Europe speaks volumes about the temper of these men, right? What they were actually made of. As you know, Richard would end up leaving, but before doing so, he wanted to definitely resolve the dispute regarding the throne of Jerusalem. To this end, at the beginning of April of 1192, he convened a council in Ascalon comprising army leaders and local Frankish noblemen to entrust the question to their vote, right? A sort of election. However, the outcome was disappointing for the Lionheart, because all those present, that were essentially the barons of Jerusalem, the Templars, the Genoese, unanimously chose Conrad, and the Lionheart had no alternative but to accept their verdict. As a result, Conrad would finally be recognized as the king of Jerusalem officially. This was not to last long at all, right? The Piedmontese nobleman would be killed within the same month, and we can't think of, say, reasons. On April the 20th, the Count Henri of Champagne, who was Richard's nephew, arrived at Tyre at the head of a sumptuous entourage, by the way, to officially offer Conrad the crown that he greatly desired. His coronation was intended to have taken place in Acre a few days early. However, Conrad would have not left Tyre to be crowned. On April the 28th, 1192, Queen Isabella, who was pregnant with Conrad's daughter, the future Queen Mary, that is the future wife of John of Brienne. It's another very important family, as you know, that was in between, like Outremer, Romania. I made a video just about, in fact, Levantine and Latin imperial warfare, and that would be an important family that later fought also against the Catalans. They had a lot of involvement, especially in Italy, but also in the 100 Years of War. Failed to return in time for dinner. So Conrad waited for her, but was informed that the queen would be late. Conrad, who did not wish to dine alone that evening, then decided to visit his friend, the Bishop of Beauvais, and have a dinner with him. The Bishop of Beauvais was a trustee of the King of France, right? The northeastern French Picard in this case. Diocese had served importantly in the process of Capetian state building, and have dinner with him. Conrad rode to the bishop's residence on horseback. This was within Tyre, right? Accompanied by only 2 knights as escort. Which tells you also, in general, how politically secure he felt, also personally, in Tyre. However, unfortunately, his friend the prelate had already finished his meal by the time Conrad arrived. Disappointed by this turn of events, Conrad decided to return to his palace. And it is specifically this decision that would ultimately prove fatal to him, because that evening Conrad retraced the road home, and as he approached the cathedral of Tyre, the road immediately narrowed, and on either side of this narrow passage 2 monks were seated. The Marquis paid them no heed, but as he drew closer, the 2 monks stood up, and one of them handed Conrad a letter. And when the Marquis, as soon to be king, instinctively extended his hand to take it, the man swiftly pulled a knife from his tunic and stabbed him. Conrad's bodyguards intervened, killing the assassin. However, at the same time, the second false monk jumped on Conrad's horse and completely finished him, by repeatedly striking the Marquis on the side. And immediately after this, the second hitman also managed to escape and sought refuge in a church, where he was subsequently apprehended and taken to prison with the intention of extracting the names of his instigators through torture. Right. However, the manner of the assassination left no doubt as to the identity of the individual attackers. It was not possible for anyone to openly attack a man of such importance with a total disregard for their own life, risking the retaliation of the victim's bodyguards, except for one specific actor in the East. And you know what we are talking about, because we made a video about them. This was the Nizarite sect of the Septiman Ismaili Shia Muslims. The Nizarites were this veritable order, right, in the Islamic world, controlling some key fortresses. Their most famous one was Alamut in northwestern Iran, considered to be impregnable, except the Mongols at some point arrived, managed to storm it. And that was, in fact, fringe sect, the dominant religion, at least when we look at this Levantine era, was Sunni, right? The Shia were not really were not prevalent, but they had this particular sect, because Islam is sort of way more complicated in its old division and fragmentation than Christianity, especially at this point in history. And they lived as sort of outcasts. It was all a Neoplatonic doctrine of the awakening, etc. It's very fascinating. Reason for which the Nizarites had basically entrenched into their fortresses, mostly surviving, offering their services as the top assassins of Western Eurasia. These were the followers at the time of Rashid al-Din Sinan, also known as the Old Man of the Mountain, the charismatic leader of the sect. And the individuals responsible for Conrad's murder were referred to by the Europeans from al-Shishiyun, which had nothing to do with hashish and nor any drug consumption, because you actually had to be incredibly lucid in order to carry out the type of hits that the assassins would, but from asas, which in Arabic means principle, and that referred to the specific doctrine that these people were in fact radicalized with and trained themselves through, right, with this blind obedience of literally just doing whatever their master said, and even dying just out of the... Apparently there was an episode in which one crusader was showed the power of such discipline when their leader just told a couple to throw themselves down a balcony and die just for no reason, but for showing how blindly loyal, fanatic, and radicalized they were. And the individuals commonly referred to as assassins, though, did not actually consume hashish, nor were they brutal murderers, say in the butchery sense. Like they were not even akin to some sort of Middle Eastern ninja, right? Instead, they were highly effective hitmen, driven by their profound religious fanaticism, and they had earned this by being persecuted by the entire Islamic world for their religious belief that had started with Nizar, in fact, founding the order, developing a genuine talent for dissimulation, a profound dedication to the survival of their community, even to the point of martyrdom, that, as you know, is a big deal in Shia Islam, and that especially in this, among the Septimans, the also the Duodecimans, etc., it is even more mystical and radical in that regard. So swiftness, not being discovered, managing to, for example, blend in with other people, right? It seems that the two monks involved, fake monks involved in Conrad's assassination, had previously been two servants of his that had actually acted as if they were Christian, right? So they could be of different backgrounds as well. They would have all kind of people, just even faking their origin, whatever. In this case, feigning adoption of their customs and professing their faith, for which you have to be considerably educated, by the way. And even their active proselytism took place in the strictest secrecy. It was just like not just a sect, but also initiatic cult. And however, when they faced persecution, the individual responsible for it was murdered by the old man of the mountain in the most overt and therefore instructive manner possible. The execution was entrusted to hitmen who, like sleeper agents, were seemingly fully integrated and about which the intended victim could have no suspicion whatsoever. Here we're talking the grandnephew of also Richard Lionheart, Edward I, would actually fall victim to the assassins with a poisoned knife, and his wife sucked off part of it from the wound, and barely escaped with his life. He was sick for a considerable time after that before he recovered. Just to say how nasty. And that guy had literally appeared in his tent, and where he attacked him. And so we're talking about just actually the English expedition of the aforementioned Tunis expedition. However, finally arriving in the English contingent in the Holy Land. We've seen it in a video about Edward I. We will surely look better at that expedition because it's sort of underrated, quite fascinating. And so we have seen what this thing was about. Al-Dinan had been also this time consistently targeting specific individuals who were felt to be a direct immediate threat to the Nizarites, who were a minority within a minority, were also unable to confront their opponents on the battlefield. They didn't really have an army, and we've seen again what their organization was like from a military point of view. I'll post the link to the video in the top fixed comment down below. However, their terroristic tactic provided extremely effective in eliminating or intimidating their opponents. And it could really turn out useful just for selling their service to anyone who would thus give them some support, right? Would avoid just to also start besieging all these various citadels they owned that were not much of a territorial state, but still would have cost too much to storm individually. Now, going back to Conrad's assassination, the surviving killer, subjected to torture, accused King Richard the Lionheart of being the instigator before dying. We'll see now what the options are. Like, we do not really know. This could have been just a diversionary mean anyway, because he would have been killed. So at that point, what was the it's hard to be in the mind of a 12th century assassin. We do not know also for how history is being referred to us. Just given what had happened that we've seen, the accusation was so credible that Leopold of Austria, Conrad's cousin, as we were saying before, like Conrad's mother was a Babenberg noblewoman, arrested King Richard as he was passing through his German lands on his return journey. This is very famous. This time, like, it wasn't really much of a money for, like, but by the Third Crusade, expeditions went by sea, right? Richard had lost a lot of money and all this was in this difficulties. Leopold had some personal grievances towards him anyway, because he had, because of a dispute, thrown Leopold's ensign into a sewer, which, in 12th century, like, chivalric perspective, is not exactly the nicest thing you can do to someone. Thus, Richard would be famously imprisoned for years in the Dürnstein castle on the Danube. If you ever visit, like, it's not very distant from Vienna. We'll talk soon about some Austrian warfare, more or less like Babenberg times. And you know the story, like we talked about Richard's credit card function. Like, it's as far as his imprisonment was concerned, his mother played like all this many chords as possible just to bring his son home, which meant paying a disproportionate amount of money. So while the idea that Richard may have, by leaving, commissioned this assassination plausible, is still to be unproved. Like, Leopold believed that, but he was also, as we've seen, pretty biased against Richard in that specific case. As we know, Leopold would later release the English king only after demanding the large ransom we were discussing. The list of suspects for the murder was quickly expanded to include other names. Naturally, the first individuals suspected were Unfred IV of Toron and Guy of Lusignan, right, that had been sort of slapped in the face. I mean, the first guy had literally, seen his wife raped, abducted, and married to Conrad. Guy of Lusignan had his own issues just for having been defeated at, and you do not emerge quite psychologically sound from a situation of this kind. It is not, by the way, unreasonable to imagine that a personality as concrete and dedicated to a pragmatic policy as the Old Man of the Mountain would have been inclined to act on a personal whim of revenge, even if it was of a low level and without any tangible consequences. There was also some, by the most updated historiography, theory about Henri of Champagne that had just arrived, as we've seen, in Tyre to assassinate Conrad. And the Crusaders, in fact, unanimously elected him as the new king of Jerusalem. There are reasonable doubts to raise about his suitability for the role as well, particularly given his failure to take action against the Nizarites during his reign. Surprise, surprise. It's, however, an hypothesis. It's possible that he did not take action against them out of fear, repeating the fate of his predecessor, rather. Or perhaps because he had some ties with them, and just preemptively. You can imagine that basically everybody, Conrad included, was negotiating with the Nizarites, depending on what was at stake. Also, because if you didn't use them, like they would have been used against you or some way, as we've seen. Conrad was plotting with the same Saladin, but naturally we're talking about different things. Conrad's plan was really one of a powerful ruler wanted to re-establish Jerusalemitan power, right? So the idea is that it's an equally valid, is more straightforward hypothesis that Sultan Sinan, on his own initiative, ordered the assassination of Conrad. Right. This, first of all, would have been intended to cause bewilderment and confusion within the Crusader camp, but also to maintain a balance of forces with Saladin, right? Because if Conrad had finally been consecrated as king of Jerusalem, he would have surely inflicted a severe defeat to the Nizari Ismailis that did not really have the military capacity to cope with him. So it's possible that the assassin sect overall would have benefited from a less determined and more tolerant monarch like Henry of Champagne. And after Conrad, in fact, there wasn't really much of a coming back of Crusader power, as instead he had sort of embodied for this while. And again, especially the political cohesion that, as we have observed at the, let's say, gathering of the Jerusalemitan vassals, was really an incredibly promising one for further, maybe not the reconquest of Jerusalem directly, but something like in the negotiation with Saladin was something about Jerusalem itself. We all know that Frederick II would manage to pull off a deal for which Jerusalem was symbolically restituted after having had her walls raised, and for a while. Then there was the cerebral Khwarezm and sack, all this kind of stuff, but that's also another era. Right, at this point, there was still something could be done, and Conrad would have been surely a protagonist in this. At this point, of course, the kingdom was crippled by the loss of the capital, by so many losses, also an important one after Hattin in that battle. But we should sort of bust a bit the myth that there was nothing there for the Crusaders in general. Like the Kingdom of Jerusalem actually had an enormous potential. It was actually easy to defend to an extent. If anything, it was always a problem of Western commitment. Like there were few Crusaders who would go there to stay. There were manpower shortages, but overall, right, there were different options. Like also, if Hattin had not happened, like why would actually that turn would have been taken? Like if previous smaller engagement, as we know, that paved the way to Hattin had not occurred, like history could have taken a very different turn. There wasn't any undefeatable enemy out there, nor any overwhelming force. The same Saladin was sort of desperate for Hattin, because hadn't he gained that major victory, he would have probably also not passed onto the legion, the very capable ruler that he was in many ways, and exactly proven by that example. But he also had a very uncertain power base. Like had he lost that battle, like again, everything would have gone very very differently from Egypt for Syria and so on. And made multiple videos on this topic, but there's always so much more to dig in to understand the reality, the concrete governmental challenges that all these rulers faced. I would like to conclude with what I was pointing out at the beginning of the video as far as the pop culture reception of the figure of Conrad of Montferrat, mostly due to William Scott, who in the Talisman, his novel, perpetuated the negative legend about Conrad that has endured to this very day. In the Anglo-Saxon world, as a consequence, Conrad of Montferrat is often regarded as the treacherous archetype, like prone to betrayal, deceit, willing to stab others in the back, and commit any other reprehensible act. So the primary reason for this unfair and flattering portrait lies, of course, also a bit in the English chronicles of the time. We're at the beginning of the 19th century, and obviously, an author like Scott was biased against Conrad, mainly due to his conflict with Richard Lionheart. But it's not also there is this general idea that is reflected in Scott's Conrad's portrait as a hateful and cowardly individual, right? That unfortunately was taken up by subsequent authors and even in cinematic and television dramas, connected with the characteristic Northern European Gothic literature of the period to portray Italians as formidable antagonists for its blonde heroes with impeccable reputation. And aside from the fact that Conrad would have likely been also pretty white himself, he was surely seen as modified in this vision of perpetuating again the Black Legion, and this sort of more degenerate, treacherous and faithful Lombard, like the idea that again the Italians were fundamentally just merchants as opposed to knights. Actually, this was the highest feudal European nobility of the time. Saint Conrad, in a way, was not particularly connected with the communes, right? And even if it had been in a general sense, still he would have not understood much of this idea that also hasn't made him particularly famous in Italy as well, not because of what was written about him in the 19th century, but mostly because of general lack of interest in the same Middle Ages as the sort of decadent time, or where everything after all is sort of dark and gloomy, also in the same Gothic literature, yes, of values and whatever, but that still looks mostly at national context rather than the imperial Catholic one. And of course, when we look at Conrad's more positive light, based on his actual merits, we see some different figure. And of course, there is the stereotype of this northern southern thing was a thing also in the Middle Ages. It wasn't really invented in the age of nationalism, but of course was intended mostly in a general popular sense, general ethnic one, if you want, rather than especially for the elite, right? This blood would have considered the strongest. After all, Conrad defeated the Saint Lionheart in politics, and there is no doubt that there was a great consensus also by all these various, mostly French crusaders, but there were also the same Italians. There were, as seen, other also German elements who had supported him. And so one has to understand better the Third Crusade and what was Lionheart's zeal, right, and what kind of political alignment had to follow in the first place. So the 19th century has really created our own idea of the Middle Ages in ways that are difficult even to distinguish in the way they were made. In the 19th century, wherever you look at, there is this sort of instead truly cowardly sense of, my place is special because I was born there. And this people, it's not even that we're, I don't know, accomplished medieval knights. Like if you're going to paint these guys, of course that's a novel, that's fiction, but if there is some historical claim to that as well, and this remains impressive in temper over time, it's definitely the product of some lower standard in humankind that forgot actually what these people individually believed in, and also collectively, of course, at the time, for real. They would have never reasoned in that way, also because, as you notice, the international elite was the elite was pretty international, in that nobiliar superiority over the rest of the people. So, frankly, yes, you can also bring that stereotype in a nobiliar sense, saying, at least noblemen are better than commoners, say, also in Scott's view. But it's also about this lack of real also historiographical tools at the time. It's something you have to understand. Medievalistics was being born at the time, and up to that point you can't even say the British had made greater efforts like to unveil it than other European countries. So in general, there is a lot that deserves to be listened, to be observed, and history is always this, like, it was never like you really thought it was, right? Not just much because you weren't there, but because in order to just know the essentials, like in today's world, you must have some kind of general objectivity and tools and morality and scientific background, and it's not easy at all. Like, even as a medievalist, I look at this stuff and I say, okay, well, I'm not an expert on the topic, but just reading some reliable source, like putting things together, accepting like the also the possibility that there is always something extra to dig, like it's not over yet. These are all aspects that are, should be at least contemplated before expressing judgment. And this, of course, in pop culture was hardly done, right? And that's unfortunately the main issue with it. Now, for today, however, we stop it here. We will keep talking surely about similar topics. Like this one was just more based on say the Crusade background, but as you understand, also Conrad's exploit in Italy are quite interesting, and the general political situation, Constantinople, in the Holy Roman Empire, in France, England, is all to be in the same Holy Land, like it's all to be uncovered, right, in Egypt and beyond. But for today, just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.